Greetings, this is Ted A. Roberts with Seeking the Everlasting Gospel Ministries, and today we're getting back onto our book, The Church and the Fivefold Ministry, Should We Put Our Trust in Man? And we are now at chapter 2, which is entitled, Should We Put Our Trust in Man? So let's go ahead and get started on this. Let's go to Psalms 118, verses 8 and 9. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in man. It is better to trust in the Lord than to put confidence in princes. Now, there is a question that does arise in many people's hearts. Should we put our trust in man? 1 Corinthians 11:1. Be you followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. Now, this passage, as expressed by the editors of the King James Version, KJV, a Bible translation which has reigned supreme for many years, might actually cause some people to misunderstand what Paul was suggesting. Now, before we go any further, we have our first explanatory note for this, for may actually cause some individuals to misunderstand what Paul was suggesting. Now, I actually went over in some pretty good detail in my book. In the beginning, it was spiritual from the very start, about the pros and cons of biblical translations into English. I also suggested there that there are certainly differences in sentence and word expressions in ages gone by than as compared to us today, as we talk now. Knowing assuredly that they also, the King James Version panel, had to deal with ancient languages themselves when they translated the Bible from the original languages. That is, when we realized that this translating task was mostly the work of William Tyndale, where, as I've just said, expression of thought and phrase can be varied as to what we might understand today. Now, before going any further, when I mentioned Tyndale, I've got a subnote coming up for him. Now, I know I spoke about him in one of the other books that I just got through recently reading, but this is just going to be a quick summary. I won't get into great detail like I did in other work, just a reminder to my listeners about Tyndale. Now, I'm going to be covering with greater detail the topic of Bible translations in my upcoming book called The Bible is Not a Buffet. But in the meantime, actually it's called The Bible is Not a Buffet, Its History, Its Reliability. But in the meantime, please know that with my present wording, that is, when I said the King James Version may actually cause some individuals to misunderstand what Paul was suggesting, that was not issued as a warning for the readers or the listeners to be leery of that particular Bible translation, the KJV, but to just be aware instead of modern phraseology as opposed to older and more ancient phraseology, and also of knowing that the audience of the 1600s AD, when the King James Version was published in 1611, they may have actually understood this thought perfectly when it was compared to the original teaching that Paul was trying to convey in the Greek language. Also, and because of that, we're not to suddenly think that the King James Version is ready for the trash can, nor that it's no good for us today because of that ancient phraseology. But that opinion belongs in the pros and cons arguments of Bible translations also. And I'm going to add also that it may be wiser decision to become educated on the King James Version language rather than trusting in some modern corrupted Bible versions. But again, as to what those are, that is, which versions may or may not be corrupted, I'm going to speak somewhat on that in my upcoming book on, again, the Bible's Not a Buffet, its reliability, its history. Now, let's go ahead and talk real quickly about Tyndale in this subnote. That is, when we realize that this translating task was mostly Tyndale's work. Now, I slipped that statement in because I wanted to let my audience know that I'm very well aware of what the King James Version claims on its cover page, that not only do the translators say that their version was newly translated out of the original tongues, But it also said, and more accurately I might add, that it was also with the former translations digitally compared and revised. Those translations, one should know, were predominantly just really one. That was Tyndale's work from about 100 years beforehand, in about AD 1535, who was the first person to directly translate the Bible from the original languages, especially since John Wycliffe's version, circa AD 1390, which before Tyndale was the only complete English Bible in existence, was simply translated from Jerome's Latin Vulgate of the 4th century AD. The translations that appear between Tyndale and the KJV were also dominantly Tyndale translations, really. But for further research on Tyndale's translation being a main influence, if not the main influence, for the King James Version, please see God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible by Adam Nicholson, Perennial HarperCollins Publishers, 2004, especially on pages 221 through 225. Without trying to infringe on copyright issues, I like to at least quote Mr. Nicholson on page 224 when he says, "Far from burying Tyndale, the 1611 translators actually honored him. They were quite explicit about their debt to the past." I know I've already said this, but with a little more detail in a previous book. I think it was when I was reading Satan, Devil, and Hell, but we're almost done with this. I just wanted to insert this to make sure that we understand this. Not only, but on page 220 of Mr. Nicholson's book, when explaining that the King James Version panel tried to put their task beyond his, as in advancing, not destroying, he added, what they did could not have been done without Tyndale. Also see Book of Fire, William Tyndale, Thomas More, and the Bloody Birth of the English Bible by Brian Mailhan, Abacus, 2011. Perhaps more especially the works by David Daniel, who's been called the foremost modern authority on both Tyndale and Shakespeare, and his works include Fresh Tyndale, Old and New Testament Publications, 1992, Yale University for the Old Testament, 1989 for the New Testament. His introductions and notes therein are very helpful, and also David Daniel's biography on Tyndale called William Tyndale, a Biography, 1994, Yale University also. All right, let's get back to the main part of the book. I'm going to reread the last sentence so we can continue on. The passage of 1 Corinthians 11:1, where it said, "Be you followers of me, even as I also am of Christ," that passage, as was expressed by the editors of the King James Version, a Bible translation which has reigned supreme for many years, may actually cause some people to misunderstand what Paul was suggesting. We may hear Christian leaders today declare very boldly, "Follow me as I follow Christ," just as the man Moses led the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, as he himself was led by God. But the children of Israel in turn had actually questioned Moses' authority, asking if he really was truly being led by God. As there were those who questioned the Apostle Paul's authority, and even that of Jesus' authority. So, and since they were found to be true men of the word, why question any of the pastor's authority today? Follow them, many say, as they themselves are following God. Is that not the pattern of heaven? But how do other Bible versions render this passages in 1 Corinthians? Tyndale, from his 1535 AD translation, says, "Follow me as I do Christ," which is about the same, which is not surprising, seeing that the King James Version is mostly an update of Tyndale's translation anyway, as seen at that last explanatory note that we just got through reading, may actually cause some individuals to misunderstand what Paul was suggesting. But how about J.P. Green's more modern literal translation? Now, I will just say real quickly that of all modern translations, I trust J.P. Green's more than most others. It's very interesting history to get into, to learn about his Bible translation. But the translation that I enjoy from him is found in his interlinear Bible, which lists the Hebrew and the Greek along with English and the Strong's numbering system. I didn't really care for his modern translation that was aside from that, but when he uses it word for word in the interlinear, that's a very interesting translation. But anyways, this is what he says from his literal translation from the interlinear. Be imitators of me as I am also of Christ. Now that's a little different. But what does really the Greek say? That's what's really most important. Imitator, follower, mimetes from Strong's Greek Dictionary, and imitator, a follower. To imitate, to follow. So really, either translated version could be right in one sense or another. However, the King James Version could lead one to believe that pastors become authoritative leaders, maybe even mediators between the saints and God, when all along Paul could have simply meant that other people should, on their own steam, press toward the mark and the goal of Christ, just like he himself was doing, but with fear and trembling, as he said later in Philippians 2:12. Let's look at that real quick. Philippians 2:12, wherefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, not as in my presence only, but now much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. So, what's the real answer to this? Do we follow the man of God? That is, have him to become our headship, that we begin following blindly as he leads us to Christ, and to let him be our mediator between us and God? Or as J.P. Green Sr. has suggested, to simply follow the pastor's example, imitate his pattern of godly dedication. In fact, of the approximate 38 Bible versions compared at the online page Bible Study Tools, which can be seen at this website right here, we see boldly that most of them emanate the imitating of Paul's own actions, or suggest following his example, rather than the people following him personally as if he were their headship. While having that in mind, let's now closely examine our modern day man of God, okay? But just who is the man of God? Is it the pastor of a church? For indeed anymore, and in many places, it seems as if the pastor is the only recognized authority. And I've even heard of church meetings where if you weren't a pastor, you weren't even allowed to get up and speak or preach. Ministers seem to forget that there were 4 other leadership offices mentioned by the Apostle Paul: evangelist, prophet, teacher, and apostle, as is seen in Ephesians 4:11. But if you see what's happening, a pastor usually has the power over a group of people to be their spokesman for and from God. And a lot of times a pastor will even take on the office of a teacher. Some will take on the office also of a prophet. There will be a few to apostolize other churches. So then when the pastor becomes the only recognized authority, now let's look at this in reality. How far should he go in becoming a shepherd to the people? How much power is he allowed to wield over the people under his care? Can any of the sheep question his authority at all? Is everything he teaches the people nothing more than gold nuggets of truth streaming down from heaven? I mean, every word